much for joining me. If you do not know who I am, my name is Kimberly Cauble. I am a full-time middle school teacher, but I'm also a part-time photographer. And when I can blend my passion for teaching with my passion for photography together, I am in my happy place. And it is finally summer, so I'm having a little bit more time to record some content. And today we're going to talk about, I think, what is the most important thing to know as a photographer and any artist really, which is composition. This is the first lesson I always teach my photography club students. And you can do this with a fancy camera. You can do this with pencil and paper. You can do this with your phone, with painting, whatever. But it is basically the art behind the photography. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about some of the 10 rules for composition that I always talk to my students about. And I'm going to use my old PowerPoint, so hang in there with me. I'm going to share with you some tips and some sample photos, and then hopefully you'll be able to go out there and make some beautiful images. All right, so let's dive right into this idea of composition. What is composition? Composition means a lot of things to a lot of different people. For example, for musicians, it can be composing music, writing music, creating music. For artists, it's composing their art, whether it's painting or plaster or sculpture, whatever, but they're creating it. And then for writers, it's composing the words on the paper that create the story or the poem or whatever piece they're writing. So it's all about creating. So when we think about photography composition, we're thinking about how we create the images, how they look the way that we want them to look. So ultimately, composition is about creating. That is why photography is such a creative art. So these are my list of rules for composition. There are many, and different artists, different photographers will have different lists, but these I think kind of encompass at least the majority of the ideas behind composition. So these are the 10 that we're going to talk about briefly today. I'm not going to get into a lot of nitty-gritty details about each one. That would be, I could have a 30-minute lesson on each one of these. I'm just going to expose you to all of them so that you are aware of what to begin looking for. So you've got rule of thirds, symmetry and balance, leading lines, background, natural frames, focus and depth, patterns, color, contrast, angles, and then cropping / aspect ratio in the world of social media. That's what we know it as. So the first one is the rule of thirds. And I've kind of got on the screen here this little grid line. If you divide your space into thirds, a top third, a bottom third, a middle third, and then the same thing goes for the left, right. And then focus your subject along one of those lines. Not everything has to be centered. We'll talk about that a little bit with symmetry and balance as well. But not every image that you have has to have the subject in the middle. One of the things that one of my favorite photographers talks about is the way that good composition makes your brain feel. That's Caitlin James, and I'll give her a little plug at the end here. But she talks about how your brain is happy when these things are happening. So the rule of thirds is a natural thing that your brain will be happy with. So if you can position, like you see in this picture here, the tree is in the right third of the photo, and it's just interesting. And then in the left third of the photo, you've got the little boat that's kind of moving across the St. Augustine River Bay. I can't remember what that thing was called. That's where I took this photo a few years back. So that just makes your brain happy. So using the rule of thirds is one element of composition. Here's another couple of examples. I had a bridal portrait session several years back, and she wanted like a magical forest. And so I found the most magical forest area I could in my location. The light was just beautiful, but I positioned her instead of in the middle because she was looking off to the side. Your eyes kind of follow her train and follow her dress. And that's also leading lines. All of these things work together. But that is an example. And then down in the bottom picture, Carolina Beach. Last summer, there were some fireworks. And so I positioned the fireworks in the right third, and then some of the buildings in the bottom left third, which is just more interesting to your eyes. Another idea that kind of goes along with that is your symmetry or balance. Sometimes people think that you have to have your subject right in the dead center of your photo, but they don't have to be. It's okay to be creative. It's okay to make things perfectly balanced, like this walkway to the beach. But also down in the bottom right corner, there's the soccer ball, and the way that the soccer ball was positioned, kind of angled, it just made it more interesting to put it in the right side of the photo. It kind of gives you some space for that ball to be kicked or to be moved, and creates a unique balance. Leading lines, again, all these kind of work together, using natural lines that are in the scene to help guide the viewer's eye to your subject. So Morgan here, my bride, was sitting on a stairwell, and it had a really curvy hand grip. What do you call it? Stair rail. What are those things? And then the lines of the stairs coming down behind her, and then the way her dress was kind of flared out towards the bottom just kind of created an interesting composition with lines. And then I had an engagement session with a bride named Tori, and I loved the way that her hands, she just naturally positioned her arms on the fence line there with her tattoo and then her ring, and it just kind of flows naturally. The wording flows right over to where her ring is from her tattoo, and I just thought that was a really interesting line. And then on the bottom right side, there's a picture of a bride and a groom, and they're walking along a pathway, and it was giving them a little bit more space to move, but also kind of creating an interesting composition. There's the flowers over there on the left, the way the tree is angled, and then they are on the right. So it's kind of using the idea of leading lines, the rule of thirds, all together. And you can kind of play with angles to get different lines to be more visible in your composition. So in talking about lines, I always have to talk about horizon lines. I don't know if this is just something that drives me crazy personally, or if it's a legitimate rule for composition, but if there is a horizon line in your photo, like if you're at the beach and there is a straight flat line, you've got to keep it straight. Your eyes do not like seeing crooked. Your brain does not like seeing crooked horizon lines. And I've seen this so often where somebody has a beautiful, beautiful composition on the beach, but it's a little tilted because the horizon line in the background is not straight. And that just, for me personally, makes my brain go a little bit wonky. I don't like that. You also want to make sure, if there's a horizon line, that you don't chop off people's heads. This is an example of a bridal portrait I took of Sophia, and I actually had another photographer, Haley Jeter, gave me some feedback on it. And one of the things she told me, and I stuck with me for years, is the line in the background between the grass and the tree is like chopping her head off, and that just looks a little odd. So be aware of where your horizon lines are in the background, and make sure that they're straight and that they're not chopping somebody's head off. Speaking of the background, that kind of leads you into the idea of making sure that your background does not overpower your subject or does not distract the viewer from what you're trying to get them to look at. This is an example of a first look between Morgan and Skylar a few weeks back. And if you see in the original photo here on the left, there are some really obnoxious air conditioning systems in the background. Now, I could not move those, obviously. There's a lot of ways that you can eliminate clutter from the background physically. Just move things. If there's sticks on the ground or if there's junk in the foreground, if people have littered, you can very easily just pick those things up and move them out of the way. But I could not move an air conditioning unit out. So I used the magical little tools in Photoshop and Lightroom to get rid of those, and it just creates a little less distraction. You're able to focus a little more on the bride and groom instead of what's going on in the background. But even better, you can separate your subject from the background by using different lenses or just zooming in. This one, I believe, was taken with my 24 to 70 millimeter lens, and then this one was with my 85. So you're able to focus a lot more by zooming in and eliminating the background distraction. So just make sure your backgrounds are not distracting, that you don't have trees growing out of people's heads or ears. I'm always looking for that when I do my portrait sessions. Another example, this was shot by my amazing second shooter, Blakely, a few weeks ago. And this groom was straightening up his tie and helping him get ready. Well, in this picture on the left, the background is very cluttered. There's a TV on the wall. There's a Belk's bag and a bunch of other stuff hanging. And all you have to do sometimes is shift your perspective, physically move somewhere where you have a better background. This one is a lot more focused on the subject and less distracting by all of the clutter in the background. You can also use your white space strategically. This is a picture of some fall leaves that I took over Lake Wylie a few years ago, and I loved the reflection. At the top and the bottom, there's kind of this white space, but in the middle, it creates this really unique composition because of that white space. So you can use white space. I've seen a lot of images, and I don't have any of these personally, where there's a couple or a family and in like the tiny corner, and then there's all this white around them from the sky, or there's a silhouette, and they're just absolutely beautiful. So you can use white space strategically in your background as well. Natural frames, another element of composition to look for. If you can shoot through something to focus on your subject, things in nature, buildings, moving objects. And the one on the left here, I was shooting through a door right outside of the sanctuary before the bride walked down the aisle. And I just thought, oh, that is the coolest little natural frame there. And it eliminates all other distractions out there in the hallway and just focuses on her and her anticipation right before she walked down the aisle. And then over here on the right, I was taking a picture of a couple, and there was this cute little like garden shed, and I went around to the other side in the door and used that as a natural frame. An elevator makes a great natural frame. I've done a few of those. You can use nature. You can see there's some trees here in the foreground, and then also the background that kind of frame the couple on the right. This is an example of kind of using leading lines as well as natural framing. I had this couple last year in Charleston and put them out on the dock, and I love how they are not quite in the center, but the dock, the lines that lead to them, and then the big poles kind of frame them so that your eye focuses on the subject, which is the couple. Focus and depth is another element of composition. You want to make sure the subject of your photo is what is being focused on. You can do this in a variety of different ways using your aperture, your depth of field, which is another topic that I get into with my students, or you can make sure you're focused, zoomed in on the subject. In this particular picture, I was focusing on this cake because giraffes and mountains were very important to this particular couple. But I also wanted to capture that small cake was not all the cake that they had. They had all these cupcakes in the background. You can kind of barely see the cupcakes because they're out of focus, but the focal point is the cake. And it helps to avoid clutter. It simplifies your scene if you can focus on what's the most important. This is another example. I really wanted to get a picture of the bouquet, the beautiful flowers, but also make sure we knew that it was a bridal bouquet. So you can see in the background, the bride is a little bit blurred. Patterns, is another fun thing to look for. I always tell people, don't forget to look up. If you go into an interesting place, like a lighthouse, for example, the bottom left corner picture is a lighthouse. The lighthouse itself is beautiful, but when you go in and then you look up at the stairwell, creating that interesting spiral pattern. And then this is a picture of just a stack of wood, but it has a really unique pattern. So I snapped that at a wedding not too long ago. Color and contrast is probably one of my favorite elements. Looking for pops of color and contrast in color and lighting makes a really unique composition. So you've got this, old shrimp boat down in the water here, but then that really bright pop of pink flowers in the side that really just frames. There's natural framing there as well that just frames that shrimp boat and adds a whole element of beauty. Black and white can also be a really good way to create a beautiful image. When I use black and white over color, it's usually when the colors are distracting or when black and white really brings out the emotion. Like this particular couple was standing underneath some kind of a bridge, and it wasn't that pretty in color, but when I took away the color and just focused on the couple, it was absolutely beautiful. Here's another couple of examples of why I love sunsets, because sometimes you can get that beautiful contrast in color where you've got the blue down here at the bottom, and then the orange sunset in the middle, and then the blue at the top with sort of the silhouette of the shrimp boats. This is a picture I took of my son many years ago, and I just loved how it turned out, where he's kind of silhouetted against that orange sky, and he's not properly exposed. You can still see that he's wearing a hoodie and he's wearing some khakis, but because of the contrast in the blue, the way that he came out in kind of a dark bluish color against that orange sky, it just creates a really interesting contrast. Angles, another element of composition to play around with. You can always look at different angles. Take pictures of things from different angles. This is the cutest little girl. I think she's probably 8 or 9 now, but her mom had this beautiful mirror in the home during her 1 year birthday shoot. So we set the mirror up on the wall, and then I was like, "Ooh, let's lay it down and let her sit on it and see what we can get." And I went up on a ladder and got some really cute pictures of her from above. Just be aware of where you are standing. Do not make a dumb mistake like I did a few years ago at a wedding. I stood in a folding chair and it folded up on me, and I almost broke my ankle. I would thank the Lord I was able to get through the rest of the wedding, and I did not break my ankle. But don't stand in folding chairs. Make sure you're standing on something sturdy, or bring along a little step stool or a ladder with you. This is another example of a different, unique perspective on a candle. Obviously, from the side, it looks one way, but looking down from the top, you can see the logos. You can see the different labels for the different flavors of the candles. So a totally different perspective just by changing the angle. This was a scene that my second shooter and I shot last summer at a wedding. He went up on like a ladder, and I stayed down on the ground, and we got the same exact moment, but from different angles. And then one I kept in color and one in black and white. It just makes a really unique, different perspective, different composition. This is another example. There's my little second shooter up in the corner there, Blakely. He's amazing. And then so I stayed on the ground and shot just the standard photo of the mom walking the bride down the aisle, and he was up in a window. I told him, go up in that window and take a few pictures, and it just creates a really unique angle of the whole scene. There's some natural framing there. So using different angles, playing around with your angles can be a lot of fun. This is another example of one I was shooting a couple who was sitting right there on like a little rock wall next to a pond. And then I looked down into the pond and saw their reflection. I was like, oh my gosh, that's even more beautiful than just the straight on picture of them. So if there's mirrors around, if there is a puddle of water, if there are pools, if there's any source of water that you can get reflections in, try it, go for it. And then cropping and aspect ratio. I'm going to share with you a little tool that I use when I am creating my social media posts to help me with this. I typically edit in 4:6. So mine are either horizontal or vertical. But sometimes that is not what people want for their framing or what you are allowed to post on social media. So I'm going to share with you a little tool that I use and how cropping and aspect ratio can really affect your composition. So I'm going to share with you quickly a little tool that I use as a wedding and portrait photographer. I hate social media. I hate having to always be posting, and a lot of times people say, oh, you look like you're really busy, but it's because I have this tool. I am busy, but sometimes it's not busy doing photography, and this tool helps me pre-plan all of my social media posts, and it will automatically post at a certain time to Instagram, to Facebook. It will also help you remember to post reels at certain times. It even has a TikTok feature, but I don't have TikTok, so I don't use that, but I do use it to create my social media posts. So if you know anything about Instagram, you can't post a 4:6 vertically or horizontally. And that's what I edit all of my photos in, because it's the standard typical format. So when I am creating, let's go find an image here. I've picked this little image of the sweet little baby, and you can see it's edited 4:6 horizontally. But in Facebook, Facebook will do it, but Instagram will not. So there's a little tool right here that I can use, and you can do this in any editing tool. You can do it in Photoshop, Lightroom, but there's a cropping tool, and it has all of these different crops that you can choose, or aspect ratios that you can choose. So for example, if I'm going to post something in Instagram, if I wanted to do a landscape post, it's going to trim off the top and the bottom. So you can see I need to scoot it down a little bit to get that little baby's hands more in focus. If I wanted a portrait, I'm not sure I would even use a portrait for this one, but I would scooch it over like that, use my crop tool to make sure what's the most important thing is the focal point in my picture. Typically, what you see on Instagram are squares. So I would probably use a square format for this. It fits in there perfectly. I can center up the little hands. If you're creating stories, they also even have a size for that. I'm not going to create a story with that, but that's how you can use cropping aspect ratio to kind of add to your compositions or use your composition in the right format. Some people, when you are editing, if, for example, I edit 4:6, but they go to create an 8:10 print, it's going to chop off some of it. So you've got to be very careful to leave room at the top and the bottom of your portraits, so that if they go to print it, they're not going to trim off somebody's head or chop off their feet, which would make for a really weird, awkward composition. But that is plan that. I'm going to get rid of there. Plan that. You can type your captions. You can add your hashtags. You can auto post for a particular time. An amazing tool. So those are my 10 rules of composition, or 10 elements of composition: the rule of thirds, symmetry and balance, leading lines, background, natural frames, focus and depth, patterns, color and contrast, angles, and cropping and aspect ratio. I always tell my students, though, do this, learn this in your camera. Do this before you have to take it into editing. Digital photography does allow for editing, and there are some times when, like the air conditioning system, I could not eliminate that distraction from the photo. But if there's anything that you can do in the camera to prevent yourself from having to do a ridiculous amount of photoshopping in Lightroom or editing, that's going to make you a photographer. That's going to speed up your editing process. So don't, while you're shooting, think, oh, I'll be able to Photoshop out that later. Don't fall into that trap, because that takes time. Go ahead and move that stick out of the way, or move the couple over a little bit so that the tree's not growing out of his ear. Whatever you need to do to make yourself a better photographer in the moment versus having to fix it up later. So just last little review I always do with my students. So in this particular photo, what rules do you see? Obviously, composition is about taking all of these things and making them work together. You don't have to use all 10 in one photo, but you can see here there's some rule of thirds. The focal point is in the bottom third. There's some natural framing in the background with the way that there's angle there. There's definitely focus and depth because I'm focusing on her engagement ring and their hands. And I decided to crop this vertically because it just made more sense vertically. Here's another one. I'll give you a second to look and think. There's definitely some color contrast here. There's definitely the rule of thirds. I do have that little ladder right dead center, so I did balance this particular photo because I thought that was a really interesting composition to make me want to jump right into that really cool lake on a hot summer day. And this is when I took, you can see 2013. That was back when I watermarked everything when I posted it anywhere. But this is a Zumbathon. So it was really fun lighting with glow in the dark and black lights. So see if you can identify, you can even pause if you need to, identify some of these elements of composition. There's definitely some fun color and contrast. Focus, the leader is right there in focus with everybody else in the background. Is kind of blurry. There's some leading lines with the way that her arm is pointing back. That kind of takes you back to looking at what's going on out in the audience or for the other Zumbathon participants. There's some leading lines. There's some rule of thirds because she's over here in the right third. There's good angle there. So thanks for hanging in there with me. I hope you learned something, and I hope that I have helped you elevate your art skills, your photography skills a little bit. Go out there and practice. I'm going to post a link to a scavenger hunt that I created for my students so that you guys can download that and maybe go on a scavenger hunt yourself. If there's anything else that you can think of that I would be able to teach you, I would love suggestions. So please drop me a comment if there's anything that you would like to see me teach about in the future related to photography education. And again, shout out to Caitlin James. She just released a composition course. I've purchased it, but I have specifically not watched it because I didn't want to repeat things in this video and have people accuse me of being a copycat. But I plan on watching that. I've been doing this for 12 years, but I'm still learning. I'm always still learning and growing. And that's what I think is so awesome about photography education. There's always something new to learn. So thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Follow me on Instagram and have a wonderful day.